The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. As Sally Ride's mother watched her astronaut daughter blast into space, reporters heard her say, "God bless Gloria Steinem." Steinem is co-founder of Ms. Magazine, known and respected for her work for many feminist causes and for her writings about the changing landscape of sexual politics. Somewhat less familiar to her readers and admirers is her focus on the inner landscape, and that's the subject of her newest book, Revolution from Within, a Book of Self-Esteem. Welcome to Upon Reflection.
Thank you.
Why did you write this book?
Well, I thought I wrote it because other women needed it. That was my first reason. I had been traveling around the country for such a long time, seeing great, great women, who just didn't have confidence in themselves. So I started to look for a book to give them because I believe in bibliotherapy, it helped me. And the books I found that had self-esteem in the title were mostly kind of new age books that weren't connected to external change. They gave you the feeling that if you just changed by magic how you felt about yourself, that the world would change or the rest of the world didn't matter, which, is clearly not the case. So I thought that it would be helpful to write a book that connected internal change to external change. I mean, that's of course the way all social revolutions start, and it's the way the women's movement started with consciousness-raising groups and that kind of first great realization that we weren't crazy, the system was crazy. But we'd gotten away from that. We'd gotten into a lot of externalized, laundry-listed issues.
As you said, you began writing a book that you thought would be for other women, but something happened to really change the direction in the course of the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing that happened was that the book knew that it had to be for men too. Books are always smarter than you are, And I began to realize, of course, that even though the problem is lesser and has a socially different mask, the theft of one's whole self, that is, the taking away from men of those parts of the self that are thought to be, quote, feminine, unquote, and then men feel shame at those qualities and so on. Though it was lesser, it was still very important, so I included men. But then also, after I had written a great deal of it, I'm sorry to say.
And you thought you were almost
done. And I thought I was almost done, right. Well, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't quite know what it was. I was told by a friend of mine who read it, who's a family therapist. I mean, she kind of named what was wrong that I kind of, knew but didn't want to admit.
She said you weren't in there.
Yeah, I hadn't put myself in at all. It was repertorial, philosophical, full of semicolons, all of that. But there was none of me in it. And that gradually, with a lot of other things combined, made me realize that I had been attracted to this subject because I needed it, and and yet I had avoided it too because I was papering over a lot of fear and rage and tiredness, and that this was a journey I needed too.
Was the realization of this a moment of epiphany in a way? Does it have any parallels to your discovery and embracing of feminism as you did in the late 60s?
It does in a way, I think, because whenever you realize the why of something, it's like dropping a rock down a well. You hear it, you just know that it's right. But this was a kind of angering and sad, and not sad, but scary realization, whereas the first epiphany of feminism was exhilarating, and that's why my life has been this way. And eventually, this also became strengthening and exhilarating. But it took a while. I mean, not in the least, not least because I had written 250 of the wrong pages. You know, if you're a writer and that's your whole identity and you've spent 20 years...
It's a pretty horrible moment.
Right, sure, right. And also I just, it was hard to how shall I say, to realize that a lot of the things I thought I had chosen really had been chosen for me, that I had been following a pattern of treating myself the way I was treated in childhood. Now,
they were reactive as opposed to proactive. You were reacting to things that had happened to you, conditions.
Yeah, I was, it was, I mean, I had been, I mean, it wasn't my family did the best they could, and they certainly made me know that I was loved. I mean, I had many, many, many advantages, but I was also very neglected because my mother was an invalid.
And your father deserted your family?
No, not really. My father stayed as long as he could. He stayed till I was about 10, and it was, in a way, my mother who left first. I mean, it was more complicated than that. But in any case, the result was that my mother and I were by ourselves from the time I was about 10 years old on.
And that's a lot of responsibility for a 10-year-old child.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, looking back, I mean, I realized I was like a very small adult with a very large child, you know. And I bet lots of people listening have had this experience. You know, have had an alcoholic parent or an invalided parent, and somehow you grew up too soon. And for a woman to have this means you get a double dose of being a caretaker. Not only do you get what the culture gives to women unequally, but you also got what happened in your family.
As you said, you had papered over things, and as you started ripping that away and digging in, did you feel torn at all? I mean, after all, you're a very accomplished woman, and self-esteem is a fuel that produces a lot of different results, positive as well as negative.
Well, no, because you know, it's not like you do or don't have self-esteem. It's not like a little round, fuzzy thing, you know. But if you don't feel that your inner life is strong enough to balance the world outside, then no amount of external accomplishment makes up for that, in fact. And certainly we should be able to see that because of, I mean, think of all the men of enormous success and accomplishment for whom no amount of money, no amount of power, no amount of, you know, success is ever enough. It can't, and therefore maybe it's useful to think because then self-esteem is sort of slippery, you know, as a concept, to think about core self-esteem, that is what we generally acquire early in life, and which is a feeling that we are lovable because we're loved, that we are worth listening to because we're listened to, that we are, you know, that we are intrinsically worthwhile and unique, and not exchangeable with other people. And if you're kind of deficient in that for whatever reason, situational self-esteem, which comes from accomplishment and being compared well or being approved of and all of that, it really can't make up for it. In fact, it becomes an addiction.
Did you write this book at a specific point in your life because of certain triggers, things that had happened, things that made the time right for you to write this book or to conduct this kind of self-examination?
Well, we had lost the magazine. I mean, part of Ms. Magazine, part of the reason that I was able to write it the first time, the wrong version, you know, was because we had been forced to sell Ms. because we just couldn't keep it going economically anymore, even though we had plenty of readers, the advertisers wouldn't support it. And I and all of us were full of justifiable rage about that, and that was part of what I was covering over. Then there was also that I had been, I mean, I'm not, how shall I say, I'm not in the least saying that illness or breast cancer or, you know, is the fault of the individual. I don't believe that for a minute. You know, there are all these pollutants out there and so on. But we do have an immune system which functions more or less well, and I think that I had caused mine to function very poorly because of just being
worn down.
Totally worn down, right. So I had an experience of breast cancer that was very, very small compared to what most women experience, but still was very sobering. And there was aging too. I mean, I was over 50, and I could no longer think that my life would start in the future, you know, the way we have of living in the future. I mean, this was my life. It was a blessing. I mean, you know, really was a blessing, because all of those things made me stop. And since I was so good at functioning, I mean, if there were an Olympic team for functioning, I would be
keeping on.
right there. Right. Otherwise, I would never have stopped.
Another factor, you write about it in the book, and it's certainly been much commented on, was a love affair that can only be described, I guess, as disastrous.
No, it wasn't disastrous. It was fun, and I learned a lot. It wasn't, I don't know why people think it was disastrous. No, it wasn't disastrous at all. It's just that it was the first time that I had ever been involved with somebody whose values were completely different from mine. I mean, because I had a father who, I think in part, but it was partly just plain luck, because the number of violent men out there is so huge that it's, on statistics alone, I was just lucky. But also because I had a father who was a very loving, nurturing person. I had always chosen wonderful men, and they always remained my friends, and still do, So this was the first time that I had got involved with a man whose values were completely different from mine, and I ended up really hurting his feelings. I mean, it was a romance, not love, but actually it wasn't so crucial. The reason I put it in the book was because I thought it was really important for women especially to know that even when you're as old as I am, and even when you know better, and even when you don't want to get married, and even if you allow yourself to get really worn down and really feel bad about yourself, you can start looking for the rest of yourself in someone else and hurt other people as a result.
Well, there was a quote, and maybe it isn't accurate or not, but where you said to a friend, "Have you ever, fallen in love with a totally inappropriate man?" And her response was, "I don't think I've ever fallen in love with any other kind."
Yeah, right. No, well, I think that's true for a lot of women. I'm lucky that hadn't been true for me. But this was a chapter called Romance versus Love, and I was, though this is like an infinitesimal 3 pages, so the chapter's really built on the Bronte sisters and on Wuthering Heights as an example of romance versus Jane Eyre as an example of love, and the premise being that two semi-people, which we are trained to be as men and women, of course, masculine at one end, and a female impersonator at the other end, and so project their missing qualities on each other, and this makes romance very intense because you're literally making love to the rest of yourself, but it's also doomed because nobody can be the rest of yourself.
Well, and as you said, maybe this is why it struck me as disastrous, was that you became even more of, in your own sense, a false front in this relationship. It made you put forward even more of an image that you were less and less comfortable with about yourself.
Oh, well, that's interesting. No, I just reverted to the 50s.
Oh, you just went backwards.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't really, I never stopped arguing about politics for 1 minute, but I also became a good listener, remember that? How we used to. I didn't feel that I'd been putting forth a false front in the past, in fact, certainly not, since the women's movement, which helped give us life and give us authenticity and so on. But I did become something of a female impersonator again because it was easy, it was restful. I had missed having fun, I had missed going dancing. I thought, well, here's somebody I don't have to take care of. But it's actually not, because you hurt other people's feelings, and I regret that very much.
Is this book misunderstood? It's made a lot of people uncomfortable to see, maybe it's just the name Gloria Steinem and SelfEsteem on the same cover.
Well, I would say that there's probably more difference in the country between the media and the people than I've ever experienced before, and that this book is treated differently by the media than it is by the readers. For instance, there's a kind of assumption that this is an admission on the part of some of the media. I don't mean to generalize, but there was a sort of, well, this is weakness, she's going back on her previous life of activism, and so, bullshit, that's not true at all. I feel much stronger than I've ever been. That was wishful thinking on their part. I feel a little bit like an example that Susan Faludi should put in her Daughter of Backlash, because I think they wanted so much to think, that I had somehow recanted that they just made it up.
I was gonna bring up her book in that, I mean, her book says that the media, if it doesn't have accurate information about the women's movement, will just simply invent it.
Oh no, especially if they have accurate information, they invent it. I mean, because they must know, you know, or they could know, let me put it that way, that women are not leaving the paid labor force, and they keep writing that it's true. They certainly could have done an expose. Remember the survey that purported to show that a single woman after, I don't know what, 35 or 40, had more chance of being killed by a terrorist than getting married, which was ridiculous, you know. And moreover, they never said what chances men had either. You know, there was no comparative. But they reported this all over the place. I mean, it's an effort to say that feminism is bad for you. And I think that that's exactly what has happened to me. They want to say that somehow I was recanting, which was the contrary of the truth. I mean, really, this is an effort to support our self-authority so that we really can confront even more effectively external authority.
One reviewer was a woman who said, called it squishy because self-esteem has a certain meaning, and that whole rack of books in the bookstore about self-esteem have created a certain reputation for themselves. You write, though, about something that probably sounds very squishy on the outside, but was really fascinating, and it was a task force in California that was put together to examine self-esteem.
Yes, having read about the fate of that task force, I should have understood that you have to have really healthy self-esteem to write a book about self-esteem. Because the task force was one of the most, continues to be one of the most effective social interventions ever, especially considering that it costs less than it costs to keep one guy in prison for life. And the point of it really was to identify and evolve programs that supported in schools and in prisons and so on the idea that each person is unique and uniquely valuable. And it works, it actually works. I mean, even such simple things as a kid who is asking kids to keep notebooks and carry them with them and write down, you know, what makes them feel good and competent, or what makes them feel undermined and bad or shameful and so on. It just that simple a thing really helps. But it's also important to remember that self-esteem is the most radical single concept that you could possibly begin to talk about. I mean, Steve Biko was murdered in South Africa for talking about self-esteem to black South Africans. We don't murder people, we do them in with ridicule. And that task force was done in.
I think there's a feeling about the self-esteem movement, self-esteem books, that it's very much a part of a decade, really, that was marked by a kind of narcissism, and again, the media calling it the me decade, and also a decade of great conservatism, where the kinds of political ideas and philosophies that you've talked about for many, many years are perhaps less popular than they've been.
No, they're
in
more
many
popular
decades.
than they've ever been. Don't believe it. Look at the public opinion polls. The country is not represented by this idiot George Bush who's sitting there in the White House. I mean,
well, he was voted into office.
No, but he was voted into office because half the people don't vote. You know, and you know, lots of people feel totally despairing that any. I'm not saying that doesn't make it our fault. If we didn't vote, it does. But it's also true that from the point of view of public opinion polls, his positions do absolutely not represent the country. And self-esteem is really a very ancient concept. Self-love was thought by the Greeks to be the source of all that was good, love of family, love of nature. That if you hated yourself, you know, you couldn't love anything else. And certainly it totally correlates with bias, with violence, with destruction of nature, with, you know, I mean, everything we know about self-esteem tells us that if we hate ourselves, we hate others, and also in order to prove we're alive, since if we can't do it positively, we'll do it negatively.
What role does this book play in changing, then, the political climate, or the actions or the inactions of people that help create that climate?
Well, hopefully it will make women especially, but men too, much more rebellious than they ever were before. Because if you trust your self-authority, then you really become rebellious. And also I hope that it will begin more links between the great social revolutions, which are social justice movements over here and self-realization movements over here, because they really don't work for very long unless they're connected. I mean, for instance, I was thinking about the 12-step movements. You know, there are 10 million Americans in 12-step movements, I believe. If they'd had an activist extension, a political analysis as part of their internal activity, they certainly would have told us that Ronald Reagan was the king of denial. You know, I mean, he was the son of an alcoholic who had never examined what that meant and so on, and therefore was really into saying everything's fine. You know, there's not an elephant in the living room. No, everything's wonderful. And he certainly took the whole country into denial. No, there's no deficit. Everything's fine. There's no poverty. Everything's fine. And, you know, they could have, you know, told us that. And, you know, we need one half of the revolution just doesn't work very well without the other half, or at least it doesn't survive very long without the other half.
It's a connection that a lot of people are missing. I guess it's more direct in a book like Susan Faludi's, where you read all of this information and it makes you want to go out and do something. And you read your book, and it makes you want to think about yourself in the context of things happening.
Well, you know, I think I love Susan Faludi's book, and she likes my book. I mean, you know, I think that they're both different paths to the same goal.
They're different facets of the same.
Yeah, the danger with telling bad news, and I think that's what we've been doing for a long time, is that you make people feel they can't act, that there's nothing they can do, that they don't have a chance of being effective. And the radical potential of self-esteem is that it's the opposite. It gives you faith that the individual action matters. And it's why, for instance, the educators and many of the politicians in the Soviet Union, or what was the Soviet Union, and East European countries are trying to institute self-esteem courses in the schools, because they understand it's the basis of democracy, the idea that one person makes a difference. And if we just pile on detail after detail of what's going wrong in the outside world, we get what I think is the disease we have.
Which is a feeling of powerlessness.
Right, right. And this is about empowerment.
You said you wrote this book for men and women, but said that self-esteem really affects them in different ways. So how do you take that message to two very different audiences and put them into one book?
Well, it comes from the same thing. I mean, to have self-esteem, you have to have a self. And we have in us, we know we have in us every single human quality in unique combination, but, you know, the universe, but a unique version of the universe. And since women are told that some of them are not okay for them, and men are told this, you know, we already end up feeling that some of ourselves are shameful. And men respond to this lack of self-esteem. And also, I mean, that's just at the gentlest end of it, and that's already devastating. Then we start with child abuse and, you know, humiliating kids. And I mean, all the horrors that we know are in fact majority horrors in this country. And men respond to this in the way that the culture tells them to, which is by clinging to the masculine role and becoming super controlling, aggressive, and even violent.
I think one of the ways you put it in the book was you said women take a lack of self-esteem and they take it out on themselves, and
right.
men take that same lack and take it
out on
others.
other people. Right, but the root cause is the same. It has a gender mask, but the root cause is the same.
One of the things you also write about in the book is that I think you said if there's any hope for bridging this gap between men and women, it's in the raising of children. And your life, at least to date, has not involved a child, hasn't involved marriage. Is that, do you want to be part of, personally, of closing that gap? Is that something that you've set as a
yes,
goal?
Yeah, because I mean, being part of a movement means that you're a mother, a sister, or what, you know. And the women's movement is really, I mean, the major force trying to change the way and humanize the way kids are raised. And of course, we were all children, so but until children are raised as much by men as by women, until men, nurture and cuddle and, infants and small children, those children are not going to grow up knowing that men can be as loving and nurturing as women can. And they're going to grow up, therefore, whether they're boys or girls, dividing themselves up in some way and saying, well, if I'm a boy, I can't do this, only women do that, and that's the beginning of the theft of self-esteem.
Have men reacted? Has there been a difference in the reaction to your book between women who've read it and men who've read it?
Well, that's a good question. I'm trying to think now. I think men are surprised that there's a feminist book that welcomes them. So perhaps there's a little bit more surprise. But and men are more interested in some of the other parallels, for instance, because I keep trying to make, explaining that colonial countries, the countries that have been colonized, end up with a feminine mentality, and countries that are the colonizers, like the United States, end up with a masculine mentality. But it's not, to make these connections. I guess what I'm trying to do, because we said in the beginning that the personal is political, which is certainly true, I'm now trying to do the other end of it and say the political is personal. And they're perhaps more interested in that part of it. But they also are very interested in what it meant to them not to have nurturing fathers.
So I'll end their conversation with sort of the flip side of the first question, that is, are you glad you wrote this book?
Yes, oh yes, I am. Although in the middle of reading the reviews, I had to go back and read it again to make sure that I actually wrote this right. But here's the good part. Forget about the reviews. The good part is that it's got a response like nothing I've ever seen in 20 years of. I mean, even not like the first years of feminism, because it's bigger in a way. I mean, just quantitatively bigger. So it's like touching a match to a haystack, and there are. There are hundreds more people at signings. There are thousands more people at lectures than you ever expected, and I think it may be the only feminist book ever to be #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. I'm not sure, but it might be.
Gloria Steinem, I want to thank you for being a guest on Upon Reflection, the new book, Revolution from Within, a Book of Self-Esteem. Thanks.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.